Redditors on board an evacuation cruise report the ship continuing to run itself. Doors opening, engines adjusting, lights responding, despite zero crew remaining. The Oceanic Serenity was designed to carry 4,000 passengers and 1,200 crew members. When Marcus Webb watched the last evacuation helicopter disappear into the gray morning sky, he counted exactly 7 people remaining on board. 7 people on a floating city designed for thousands. The silence was the first thing that felt wrong. The outbreak had started in the ship's lower decks 3 days into what should have been a 2-week Caribbean cruise. Some kind of viral infection, aggressive and fast-spreading, turning healthy passengers feverish and delirious within hours. The captain had made the call to head for the nearest port, but 2 days out, the decision came down from corporate and Coast Guard both. Full emergency evacuation. Helicopters and smaller vessels had spent 18 hours ferrying everyone off, prioritizing the sick, then families, then everyone else. Marcus had stayed because of his mother. She'd been in the medical bay when the evacuation order came, sedated and stable but not fit to be moved according to the ship's remaining doctor. The doctor had assured him she'd be on the last medical transport. But when that helicopter lifted off, his mother wasn't on it. A mix-up in the chaos, they said over the radio. She'd already been evacuated on an earlier flight. He should leave immediately. The ship was going to be towed to a quarantine facility for decontamination. But something about it didn't sit right. Marcus had checked every passenger manifest posted in the evacuation staging areas. His mother's name never appeared on any departure list. So he'd hidden in one of the luxury suites on Deck 9 until the last helicopter's rotors faded into the distance. And now he was stuck on a ghost ship with 6 other people who'd had their own reasons to stay behind. He'd met 3 of them so far. A young couple, David and Emma, who insisted the evacuation had been a corporate overreaction and they'd paid too much for this cruise to leave early. A woman named Patricia who claimed her husband had been misidentified in the chaos and evacuated without her. And an older man who called himself Captain Chin, though Marcus suspected he'd never captained anything in his life. The other 2 remaining passengers he'd only glimpsed at a distance. Shadows moving through empty corridors, people who apparently preferred to remain alone. The ship was still running. That was the second thing that felt wrong. All the power systems remained active. Lights operated on their day-night cycle. The massive engines thrummed steadily beneath his feet, maintaining course and speed. Climate control kept every deck at a perfect 72 degrees. The elevators worked. The automatic doors sensed movement and opened obediently. It was as if the Oceanic Serenity didn't realize it had been abandoned, as if it was still performing for an audience that no longer existed. Marcus stood in the grand atrium, a 5-story open space of brass railings and crystal chandeliers that had once been packed with tourists posing for photos. Now his footsteps echoed like gunshots in a cathedral. The champagne bar sat fully stocked but unattended. The grand piano in the corner waited for a player who would never come. Luggage still sat in neat rows where passengers had left it during the evacuation, tagged and organized by a crew that no longer existed. He moved through the Lido deck, past the swimming pools that reflected the overcast sky like dead eyes. The poolside bar's frozen drink machines still cycled through their colorful rotations. Strawberry, lime, blue raspberry, churning for no one. Deck chairs sat arranged in perfect rows. Towels hung from railings where they'd been left to dry. The dining room on Deck 7 was worse. Tables were still set for dinner service that would never come. Plates, silverware, folded napkins and swan shapes. The buffet station stood empty but spotless, their heating elements still glowing red. Marcus had raided one of the smaller cafes for food earlier, but something about this main dining room made his skin crawl. It was too perfect, too ready. As if the ship expected its passengers to return at any moment. He found David and Emma in one of the luxury dining rooms on Deck 10, helping themselves to the wine collection. They'd changed into formal wear from one of the ship's boutiques, playing dress-up in their private floating palace. Emma had draped herself in jewelry from the duty-free shop, diamonds that caught the light as she laughed at something David said. "You should join us," David called out when he spotted Marcus. "Hell of a lot better than eating alone in your cabin. We've got the whole ship to ourselves." Might as well enjoy it. Have either of you tried the radio? Marcus asked. The satellite phone in the bridge? Emma's smile faltered slightly. We tried this morning. Everything's dead. Well, not dead exactly. The equipment's on, but no one's responding. Like we're transmitting into nothing. The Coast Guard said they'd send a ship for us, David added, refilling his wine glass. Could be a day or two. Might as well make the best of it. But Marcus had seen the ship's navigation display in the bridge. They weren't holding position waiting for pickup. They were moving, maintaining course and speed, heading deeper into the Atlantic. Away from land. Away from help. That evening, as artificial sunset lighting activated throughout the ship in perfect simulation of dusk, the PA system crackled to life. Marcus froze in the corridor outside his suite, heart suddenly hammering. The system shouldn't work. There was no one in the communications room. No one at any control station. A calm, feminine voice filled every speaker throughout the ship. Good evening, passengers. Dinner service will begin in the Ocean View restaurant on Deck 7 at 1800 hours. Tonight's special is herb-crusted salmon with seasonal vegetables. Staff will be available to assist with all your needs. We hope you're enjoying your voyage on the Oceanic Serenity. The announcement ended with a soft chime. Marcus stood alone in the hallway, listening to the echo fade. Staff would be available. But there was no staff. There hadn't been staff for 24 hours. He walked to the nearest window and looked out at the darkening ocean. The water had changed. It looked thicker now, more viscous, moving in patterns that didn't quite match the wind. And deep below the surface, barely visible in the failing light, he thought he saw shapes. Large shapes. Moving in formation beneath the ship, keeping pace. The lights in his corridor flickered once, then stabilized. Somewhere distant, he heard an elevator chime, announcing arrival at a floor where no one had called for it. The engines shifted rhythm slightly, adjusting speed. The Oceanic Serenity sailed on through gathering darkness, and Marcus realized with creeping certainty that the ship wasn't abandoned at all. It was occupied by something else now. Something that knew how to operate elevators and PA systems and navigation computers. Something that wanted them to think they were alone. At least until it was ready to reveal itself. Marcus didn't sleep that first night. He'd wedged a chair under the door handle of his suite and sat in the darkness, listening to the ship breathe around him. That's what it sounded like, breathing. The ventilation system cycled with rhythmic precision, air moving through ducts and patterns that seemed almost biological. And underneath that, the ever-present thrumming of the engines, a heartbeat that never paused. Around 2 in the morning, his suite's lights turned off on their own. Not flickering out, but dimming gradually as if someone had adjusted them from a central control system. He sat perfectly still, watching shadows deepen in the corners. Through his window, the ocean reflected no moonlight. The water looked black and solid, like polished obsidian. Then, without warning, every light in his suite blazed to full brightness. Marcus jerked upright, temporarily blinded. When his vision cleared, everything appeared normal. Bed neatly made. Television dark. Minibar closed. But the lights had turned themselves on. Had responded to something. He went to his door and pressed his ear against it. Footsteps in the corridor. Multiple sets, moving with purpose, heading toward the bow. But he'd locked the security door to this section. No one should be able to access this hallway without a keycard. Marcus eased his door open and peered out. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit by the ship's nighttime lighting scheme, a soft blue glow meant to mimic moonlight. But the footsteps continued, receding into the distance. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, nothing like the casual shuffle of tourists exploring at night. He followed the sounds to the forward observation lounge, a glass-walled room offering panoramic views of the ocean ahead. The footsteps had led here and then stopped. The lounge sat empty, chairs arranged in neat conversational clusters, floor-to-ceiling windows showing nothing but darkness beyond. But the glass was covered in condensation. On the inside, as if something cold and wet had been standing here, breathing against the windows. Marcus approached slowly, his reflection appearing in the fogged glass like a ghost superimposed on the black ocean. He reached out to touch the condensation and his fingers came away damp and cold. That's when he noticed the footprints. Wet marks on the carpet, leading from the windows to the back of the lounge, then disappearing. Not shoe prints. These were bare feet, but wrong. The proportions were off. Too long, too narrow, and there were too many toes. The sound made him spin around. The elevator at the end of the corridor had chimed, announcing arrival. Its doors slid open smoothly, revealing an empty car bathed in that same blue nighttime lighting. Marcus stared at it from across the lounge. He hadn't called for an elevator. No one was on this deck. The elevator doors waited, held open by some invisible hand, inviting him inside. He backed away slowly, returning to his suite, triple-checking his door lock. When he finally risked looking through his window again, he saw something that stopped his breath. The ship was turning. Not gradually, but in a sharp, deliberate course change. He felt it in his inner ear, that subtle shift as the massive vessel altered direction. But there was no one at the helm. No one in the bridge making navigation decisions. Morning brought no comfort. Marcus found the others gathered in the Lido Deck Cafe, helping themselves to food from the storage areas. Patricia looked like she hadn't slept either, her eyes red-rimmed and jumpy. Captain Chin sat apart from the group, staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The ship changed course last night, Marcus said without preamble. Around 2:30. Sharp turn to the south. David laughed, but it sounded forced. Ship's drift. Current wind. Not like this. This was deliberate. Someone's controlling the navigation. There's no one here, Emma said quietly. We've checked. We've been through every deck, every room we can access. It's just us. Then explain the PA announcement. Explain the lights going on and off. Explain. Marcus stopped himself, unsure if he should mention the footprints. They'd think he was losing his mind. But Patricia spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw someone last night. In the theater. I was looking for my husband. I thought maybe he'd hidden somewhere during the evacuation, that maybe he was still on board. The theater was dark, but the stage lights were on, and there was a figure standing there. Tall. Too tall. It was wearing one of the crew uniforms, but it didn't move right. It just stood there, facing the empty seats. When I called out, it turned toward me and She stopped, hands shaking. I ran. I don't know what I saw, but it wasn't human. Captain Shin finally looked up from his coffee. The crew quarters, he said. On deck 2. We should check the crew quarters. They descended as a group, none of them willing to go alone anymore. The crew sections of the ship were utilitarian compared to the passenger areas. Narrow corridors, small cabins, fluorescent lighting. Every door stood open, rooms abandoned mid-shift. Beds unmade, personal effects scattered, as if the crew had left in a hurry. But the walls in this section were covered in something. Marcus noticed it first, a dark substance spreading across the white paint like a stain. He touched it carefully. It was damp, cold, and when he looked closer he saw it was organic. Algae, seaweed, growing on the interior walls of a climate-controlled cruise ship. That's not possible, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. The growth was everywhere down here, spreading from the lower decks upward, creeping along walls and ceiling tiles. The air smelled wrong too, like low tide, like things that had died in tidal pools and been left to rot in the sun. They found the source in a storage room near the ship's waterline. The wall had split open, not from damage or structural failure, but as if it had been forced apart from the outside. Seawater pooled on the floor, and in that water things moved. Small things. Crabs maybe, or something like crabs. They scattered from the flashlight beam, disappearing into the walls. We need to send a distress signal, Marcus said. We need to get off this ship. But when they reached the bridge, they found every communication system had been disabled. Not broken, disabled. Carefully dismantled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The ship's computers were still running, navigation still active, but every system that could communicate with the outside world had been methodically destroyed. On the main navigation screen, their course was clearly displayed. They weren't heading for any port. They were heading for coordinates in the middle of the Atlantic. Coordinates that, according to the depth finder, marked the location of an underwater trench, one of the deepest parts of the ocean. The ship was taking them somewhere, and whatever had taken control of the oceanic serenity didn't want them calling for help. That night, every security door on the ship locked simultaneously, not with the gentle magnetic click of normal operation, but with heavy metallic slams that echoed through empty corridors. Marcus tried his suite door and found it sealed. He was trapped inside. Through his window, he watched the ocean change. The water no longer looked like water. It had taken on a quality he couldn't quite name, thicker, more alive, moving with intelligence rather than current. And beneath the surface he saw lights, not reflections. Actual lights, deep below, rising slowly toward the ship. The PA system activated. "Good evening, passengers. We are approaching our destination. Please remain in your staterooms. Disembarkation procedures will begin shortly." But they were in the middle of the ocean. There was nowhere to disembark to, unless something was coming to get them. The doors unlocked at dawn, releasing them from their rooms without explanation. Marcus found the others in the grand atrium, everyone looking shell-shocked and sleepless. No one wanted to talk about what they'd seen through their windows during the night, those lights rising from the depths, getting closer. But Patricia's hands shook as she clutched a cup of coffee, and even David's forced optimism had evaporated. "We need to access the engine room," Captain Chin said. He'd found a crew tablet in one of the abandoned stations, its screen showing a schematic of the ship. "If we can shut down the main engines, maybe trigger an emergency beacon that can't be disabled from the bridge." It was the best plan anyone had, so they moved as a group toward the aft elevators. Marcus noticed more changes as they walked. The seaweed growth had spread overnight, climbing up from the lower decks. Green and brown tendrils wound around railings, covered emergency exit signs. The ship felt less like a cruise vessel and more like something organic, something being slowly consumed by the ocean it floated on. Emma pressed the elevator call button. They waited, listening to the mechanism engage somewhere above. The display showed the car descending from deck 12, 11, 10, 9. Then it stopped. The display flickered, showing a designation that hadn't been there before. Deck B2. "There is no B2, David said, checking the ship's schematic on his phone. "The lowest deck is B1. Below that is just the engine room and mechanical spaces." But the elevator had stopped there. They heard the doors open, heard something shuffle into the car, heard the doors close again. The elevator resumed its descent. "B1. Lido. 7. 5. 3. It arrived at deck 3 where they stood waiting. The doors slid open. The elevator car was empty, but it was soaked. Water pooled on the floor, dripping from the walls and ceiling. And in that water, caught in the drain grate, was a clump of black hair tangled with seaweed and something that looked like it might have been skin once, white and bloated from long submersion. No one entered the elevator. They took the stairs instead, descending into the ship's lower levels where passengers rarely ventured. The stairwell's emergency lighting cast everything in harsh white fluorescence. Their footsteps echoed in the confined space, multiplied and distorted until it sounded like dozens of people descending with them. At deck B1, Marcus stopped. There was another stairwell continuing downward. According to the schematic, it shouldn't exist. The stairs should end here. But they descended into darkness below, steps wet with seawater despite being inside a supposedly watertight vessel. "That's not on any of the ship's plans," Captain Chin said, studying his tablet. "This stairwell doesn't exist." But it did exist. They were looking at it, and from somewhere below came a sound. Machinery but wrong. Grinding metal mixed with something organic. Like breathing. Like something massive inhaling and exhaling in the darkness. Marcus started down the stairs before he could talk himself out of it. The others followed reluctantly, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. The temperature dropped with each step, cold and damp like a cave. The walls here weren't the clean white paint of the upper decks. They were rough, covered in barnacles and algae, dripping with condensation that smelled of brine and decay. They emerged into a corridor that absolutely should not exist. It stretched in both directions, curving away beyond the reach of their lights. The floor was covered in an inch of seawater that rippled with their movements. And the walls were covered in growth. Not just seaweed now, but coral formations, barnacles, anemones, sea urchins. All alive. All growing on the interior of a ship that should be sealed against the ocean. "This is impossible," Emma whispered. "We're still above the waterline. How is any of this?" A door at the end of the corridor swung open on its own, revealing more darkness beyond. Not inviting them in, warning them. But they'd come too far to turn back. The room beyond the door made Marcus's mind rebel against what his eyes reported. It was vast, far larger than the ship's dimensions should allow. The ceiling disappeared into darkness overhead. The floor was covered in shallow water that reflected their lights in strange patterns. And throughout the space, massive columns rose from floor to ceiling, except they weren't support structures. They were organic, living things, pulsing slowly, covered in the same barnacles and sea growth as the corridor. "What is this place?" Patricia's voice echoed strangely, as if the room absorbed and reflected sound in impossible ways. Captain Chin was staring at his tablet at the ship's schematic. His hands trembled. "According to this, we're standing in the middle of the ship's ballast tanks. But these tanks were drained during evacuation. They should be empty. They should be." He stopped because the water around their feet was rising. Not flooding in, but rising from below, welling up through the floor itself. And in that rising water, things moved. Shapes. Sizes ranging from small to massive, all of them wrong, all of them moving with purpose toward the humans who'd invaded their space. They ran. Back through the impossible corridor, up the stairs that shouldn't exist, climbing toward the light and warmth of the upper decks. Behind them, water surged upward, pursuing them with predatory intent. They burst through the door at deck B1 and slammed it shut, hearing something massive impact the other side. The door held. Barely. They could see it bowing inward with each impact, metal screaming under stress it was never designed to withstand. The elevators, Marcus gasped. "We need to get as far up as possible." They ran for the nearest elevator, jabbing the call button desperately. The display showed a car ascending from somewhere below. B4, B3, B2. "Those decks don't exist," David kept repeating. "They're not real. They can't be real." But the elevator arrived, doors opening to reveal another soaked car. They had no choice. They crowded inside, Marcus slamming his hand against the button for deck 12, the highest passenger deck. The elevator began to rise. On the display, their ascent was normal. B1, Lido, 3, 5, 7. Then the car shuddered and stopped. The lights flickered. The display scrambled, showing designations that made no sense. Deck C7, Deck W, Deck Infinity. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened, they weren't on Deck 12. They were somewhere else entirely. A corridor that looked like a cruise ship corridor, but wrong. The carpet pattern was slightly off. The room numbers were in no language any of them recognized. And at the far end, a figure stood. Tall. Too tall. Wearing a crew uniform that was covered in barnacles, water streaming from its sleeves. It raised one arm, two long joints bending in too many places, and pointed at them. Then it spoke, and its voice was the sound of waves crashing on rocks, of drowning sailors crying out in the dark. "Welcome aboard. We've been waiting." They fled from the corridor, but the elevator refused to move. Emma hammered the buttons while David pried at the doors, trying to force them open manually. Behind them, the figure in the barnacle-covered uniform moved closer, its footsteps squelching wetly on the wrong carpet, leaving trails of seawater and dead sea life. "The stairs," Marcus shouted. He'd spotted an emergency exit, the sign barely visible through the strange lighting that seemed to pulse rather than glow steadily. They burst through the door and into a stairwell that spiraled in both directions, up and down, in a configuration that violated every principle of architecture Marcus understood. They chose up, climbing blindly, driven by primal instinct to get away from the deep. The stairs seemed to go on forever, passing doors marked with symbols instead of deck numbers. Some doors were open, revealing rooms that couldn't exist. A ballroom filled with black water and floating chandeliers, a kitchen where something massive moved between industrial ovens, a children's play area where the toys were arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. Finally, they emerged into a corridor that looked familiar. Deck 7. The main dining room. They'd somehow climbed back to a real part of the ship, or at least a part that resembled reality. But the ship had changed. The seaweed growth covered everything now. Coral formations sprouted from walls. Anemones opened and closed on door handles. The oceanic serenity was transforming, becoming something else, something that belonged more to the ocean depths than to the surface world. The engine room, Captain Chin gasped, still clutching his tablet. If we can shut down the engines, the ship will drift. Someone will find us. Coast Guard, Navy, someone. They descended again, this time using the crew stairwells they knew were real, were marked on actual ship schematics. The sounds grew louder as they approached the engine room, that grinding, breathing rhythm Marcus had heard before, but closer now, more immediate. The engine room door was sealed with a biometric lock that should have required crew authorization. But when Marcus pressed his hand against the scanner, it clicked open immediately, as if the ship wanted them to enter, as if this had always been the destination. The engine room was cathedral vast, filled with machinery that hummed and pulsed with mechanical life. 4 massive diesel engines, each the size of a building, driving the ship forward through dark water. Catwalks stretched between control stations, pipes ran in arterial networks across walls and ceiling, and at the center of it all, the main drive shaft rotated with hypnotic constancy. But there was something else here. Something the original designers had never installed. Something that had grown up around the machinery, incorporating it, making it part of something larger. Organic structures wound between the engines. Living things. Pulsing membranes stretched between pistons. Tendrils thick as telephone poles wrapped around drive shafts. And throughout the space, that smell, rotting kelp, dead fish, the exhalation of deep ocean vents. "What is this?" Emma whispered. Marcus understood, or thought he did. The ship wasn't being controlled by something aborted. The ship had become something. The oceanic serenity had been colonized, infected, transformed into a hybrid vessel. Part human engineering, part something that had risen from the depths. Movement in the shadows between engines. Something large. Marcus's flashlight caught it for just a moment. Smooth gray-green flesh, too many limbs, a shape that suggested human form the way a nightmare suggests reality. It moved with liquid grace between the machinery, perfectly at home in this space of metal and organic fusion. There, Captain Chin pointed to a control station on the far catwalk. The emergency shutdown. If we can reach it. He didn't finish because the thing between the engines moved again, rising to its full height. It stood at least 10 feet tall, its body a disturbing amalgam of human and marine life. Its face, if it had a face, was hidden behind a growth of barnacles and coral. Its hands ended in fingers that were too long, webbed, tipped with claws that scraped against metal as it gripped an engine support. And it wasn't alone. More of them emerged from the shadows. 5, 10, 20. All wearing fragments of crew uniforms, all covered in barnacle growth, all moving with that same liquid grace. They'd been crew members once, perhaps. The original staff of the Oceanic Serenity. But the ocean had claimed them, transformed them, made them part of something ancient and vast. The creatures didn't attack. They watched, waited. And Marcus realized they were hurting the humans, guiding them deeper into the engine room, towards something at the very heart of the vessel. There, in the center of the main drive shaft, something massive pulsed. An organic mass the size of a small car, connected to every engine, every pipe, every system. It breathed with the rhythm Marcus had been hearing since the first night. The heart of the ship, or what the ship had become. And from that central mass, consciousness radiated. Marcus felt it pressing against his mind, ancient, patient, hungry. It had been down there in the deep for eons, drifting in darkness, feeding on what fell from above. Ships, debris, bodies, anything that sank into its realm. But it had learned, evolved, developed the ability to infect and control, to make vessels its own. The outbreak on the Oceanic Serenity hadn't been a virus. It had been the first stage, getting everyone else off the ship, leaving only those who would serve its purpose. leaving only those it could use. The PA system crackled to life, but the voice that spoke wasn't the recorded message anymore. It was older, deeper, coming from everywhere and nowhere. You stayed behind. You lingered in our waters. Now you belong to the deep. The transformed crew members moved closer, forming a circle around the remaining humans. Their eyeless faces turned upward, toward the pulsing central mass as if worshipping. David tried to run. One of the creatures caught him almost casually, its webbed hand closing around his arm. Where it touched him, his skin began to change, graying, hardening, barnacles forming on his flesh like an infection spreading in fast forward. He screamed, but the sound was cut off as the transformation accelerated. His body convulsed, changing, adapting, becoming something that could survive in the depths the ship was heading toward. Becoming crew. Emma backed against a railing, staring in horror. No, this can't be. But the creature that had been David turned toward her, its new face expressionless behind barnacle growth, and reached out with hands that were no longer quite human. The ship's engines shifted rhythm, increasing speed. They were close now, close to the trench, close to the place where the ship would finally descend, taking its new crew with it into the darkness where such things belonged. Marcus looked at the emergency shutdown controls just 10 feet away. If he could reach them, if he could trigger the shutdown. But the central mass pulsed once, sending out a wave of pressure that dropped him to his knees. And in his mind, he heard the words clearly, "You cannot stop the voyage. You cannot leave the ship. The sea has boarded. And the sea always claims what it wants." Marcus crawled toward the emergency shutdown, his body moving against the crushing mental pressure radiating from the central mass. Every inch was agony, his mind screaming at him to stop, to submit, to accept what was happening. But he reached forward, fingers stretching toward the red emergency lever. A transformed crew member stepped into his path. Not threatening, just blocking. Patient. As if it had all the time in the world to wait for Marcus to give up. Behind him, Emma's screams had stopped. He didn't want to look back, didn't want to see what she was becoming. But he heard the wet sounds of transformation, heard Patricia sobbing and then falling silent as the change took her too. Only Captain Chin remained unchanged, backed into a corner of the catwalk, clutching his tablet like a talisman. "It's been planning this," he gasped, staring at the screen with wide eyes. "Look at the manifest. The real manifest. The outbreak was manufactured. The passengers evacuated were selected. And the ones left behind, we all have something in common. We're all alone. No close family. No one who'll look too hard when we disappear." Marcus finally reached the lever. His hand closed around it. One pull and the engines would shut down, the ship would lose power, they'd drift until someone found them. Maybe. Possibly. It was the only chance. But when he pulled, nothing happened. The lever moved, the emergency systems engaged, lights flashed on control panels. But the engines continued running. The central mass continued pulsing. Because the engines weren't driving the ship anymore. They were part of its body, organs in a larger organism, and you couldn't stop a heart by flipping a switch. The ship was alive. Truly alive. And they were inside it. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered to no one. To everyone. To the world he'd never see again. The transformed crew surrounded them, and this time they didn't wait. They reached out with webbed hands, and where they touched, change began. Marcus felt it spreading through his body, cold, inevitable, almost peaceful. His skin hardened. His lungs adapted, preparing to breathe water instead of air. His eyes changed, developing the ability to see in crushing darkness. He fought it at first, but the central mass's consciousness wrapped around his mind like a parent soothing a frightened child. "Don't be afraid," it seemed to say. "This is evolution. This is adaptation. The surface world is dying, but the deep endures. Join us. Become what you were always meant to be." And part of him wanted to surrender. Wanted to accept this transformation and live forever in the cold dark, serving something ancient and powerful. No more loneliness. No more searching for his missing mother, because maybe she'd never existed, maybe that had been the lure all along, a fabricated memory to get him to stay behind when everyone else evacuated. But another part of him rebelled. remembered sunlight, remembered warmth, remembered being human and what that meant. Captain Chen made his choice. He climbed over the catwalk railing and jumped, falling 3 stories to the engine room floor below. Marcus heard the impact, heard the wet crunch of a body hitting metal. A human choosing death over transformation. The crew members didn't react to the suicide. They simply continued their work, guiding Marcus and the remains of the other passengers deeper into the ship's body. Down through hatches that opened into spaces that couldn't exist. Through chambers where the walls pulsed and breathed. Past pools of black water where things too large to see properly moved beneath the surface. They emerged in what had once been the grand atrium, but it had transformed completely. The 5-story space had become a cathedral to whatever dwelled in the deep. The crystal chandeliers hung in water that defied gravity, floating in midair. The brass railings were covered in bioluminescent algae that glowed with eerie blue light. And at the center, rising from the floor all the way to the skylight ceiling, stood a pillar of living tissue connected to everything, feeding information throughout the ship. The PA system activated one final time. But the voice that spoke was different now. Not the recorded announcement, but something that had learned to mimic human speech, had practiced for decades or centuries or longer, studying ships that passed above its domain. All passengers, please return to your rooms. The sea will board shortly. And Marcus understood. This was the announcement that played every time. Every ship that had been claimed. Every vessel that had sailed too close to the deep places where old things dwelled. The polite warning before the ocean itself came aboard, flooding through halls, claiming everything, dragging it down to join the graveyard of ships that littered the trench below. But they weren't sinking. Not yet. First, the ship needed to reach the proper coordinates. First, it needed to deliver its cargo of transformed crew to the place where they would serve. Through the atrium's windows, Marcus saw the water rising around the ship. Not flooding over the decks, but climbing impossible, defying gravity, standing up in walls around the vessel like a liquid cage. And in that vertical water, shapes moved. Massive shapes. Things that had never seen sunlight, that existed in pressures that would crush steel, that had been waiting in the darkness since before humans built their first boats. The oceanic serenity was descending. Not by sinking, but by being pulled down into an embrace. The ocean was reclaiming what had floated on its surface too long. Marcus's transformation completed. He stood among the other changed crew members, his new body perfectly adapted to the crushing depths they were heading toward. His human memories were fading but not gone, preserved like photographs in a waterlogged album, images of a life he'd lived on the surface. And in those fading memories he saw his mother. Remembered now that she'd never been on this ship. That his entire reason for staying behind had been fabricated, planted by something that had learned to manipulate human minds through radio waves and computer systems. The outbreak, the evacuation, his missing mother, all of it designed to leave specific people behind. People who would transform cleanly. People who would serve well in the depths. The ship shuddered as it passed below normal depth limits. The hull should have collapsed under the pressure, but it didn't. It was more than steel now. It was alive. Part of the ecosystem it was joining. Through the windows, Marcus saw other ships. Dozens of them. Ghost vessels from every era of maritime history, all circling the trench like moths around a flame. All crewed by changed humans who served the deep. A fleet that would never be found because it existed below where anyone would look. The PA system spoke its final message. Welcome to your destination. Please proceed to your assigned stations. Your service begins now. Your service will never end. And Marcus moved with the others, taking his place among the crew of the Oceanic Serenity, which sailed eternal in waters darker than any dream, serving something vast and patient and hungry. On the surface, 1,700 miles away, a Coast Guard vessel reached the coordinates where the cruise ship should have been. They found nothing. Not debris. Not bodies. Not even an oil slick. Just empty ocean and the normal sounds of wind and waves. The Oceanic Serenity was marked as lost at sea. 7 souls unaccounted for. Another mystery of the deep. And far below, in trenches where pressure would crush submarines and darkness was absolute, the ship sailed on. Its engines hummed. Its crew worked. Its transformed passengers settled into eternity. And when the next vessel passed above, when the right conditions aligned, when the sea decided it was time to board again, the cycle would repeat, as it had repeated for longer than humanity had sailed the oceans, as it would repeat until the seas ran dry. The recording device in the abandoned communications room continued running, its tape capturing the sounds of the deep, inhuman songs, mechanical rhythms, and underneath it all, whispers and voices that had once been human, saying the same thing over and over. Don't sail too close to the deep places. Don't linger in dark waters. And if you hear an announcement telling you the sea will board shortly, the tape ran out, the message unfinished, a warning no one would ever hear. The end.